Denzel Washington played the part of Rubin Carter in the movie Hurricane, it awakened a controversy born several decades ago. Did he or didn't he kill 3 people in a bar in Paterson, New Jersey? The former middleweight contender spent 18 years in prison before winning his freedom in 1985. Along the way, he underwent a dramatic transformation. Here is Hurricane's story.
I've been locked up for 30 years.
One thing the film does is it does soften and glorify Rubin to an extent that doesn't show the full nature of the human being.
He put me in prison. Love's gonna bust me out.
There was a lot of fiction in the movie. The true story is much more critical for our understanding.
There are a lot of places in the movie where Hollywood took a lot of editorial licenses to make the movie what they wanted to make it.
The one great disservice, in my opinion, that movie is guilty of was they portrayed Vincent DeSimone, who was the real investigator in the Carter case, as having hounded him Javert-like all of his life. Not true. Vincent DeSimone did not know Hurricane Carter until the Lafayette Bar Grill and murders.
It is easy to create a morality tale out of Rubin's life, where you have the good guys and the bad guys, and how good finally triumphs over evil. The real story is much messier and much darker.
I thought he was an angry, jailhouse intimidator type guy.
I was bald-headed when other people were not bald. I was Fu Manchu'd when other people were not wearing Fu Manchu'd. I was mean as a rattlesnake.
Anytime black men assert themselves in society, we always recognize that some of the consequences may be deleterious, they may be deadly.
He was outspoken, menacing, and angry. 3 no-nos for a powerfully built black man during the riot-torn 60s. But personality, antisocial or otherwise, hardly placed veteran middleweight Rubin Hurricane Carter at the scene of a bloodbath in Paterson, New Jersey.
At approximately 2:30 a.m. on June 17th, 1966, 2 men entered the Lafayette Bar and Grill at East 18th Street and Lafayette Street. One in the front door, one in the side door, without saying a word, began firing weapons, killing 2 men instantly and wounding a man and a woman.
You had these 4 people lying on the floor, their guts literally spilling out of them, blood pooling up around the entire floor, so that when the first driver came from the ambulance, he opened the door, stepped inside, he literally slid across the floor because there was so much blood on the ground.
Shortly after 3 a.m., Paterson police pulled over a car with 2 black men inside.
I saw a 1966 white Dodge drive up with a police car behind it. Seated in the vehicle were Rubin Carter and John Artis.
Rubin was asking the question, what's going on? What's this all about? Why did you bring us here? At 19 years old and never having any interaction with the police, I'm scared out of my wits.
They brought us to the hospital to be looked at by this man. I still didn't understand what was going on.
They asked this man who's lying on the gurney if he recognizes Rubin, and they ask him, was this the man who shot you this evening? And the man shakes his head. He says no.
After passing a lie detector test conducted in the police station, Carter and Artis were released.
I felt as though if I did not commit a crime, that you can't put me in jail.
I really thought that was the end of it, that I wouldn't hear any more about it.
2 or 3 weeks later, Detective DeSimone, who's running this investigation, appears before a grand jury and says Rubin and John could not have been the killers. They don't fit the identifications. They had no weapons, and they certainly didn't have time to change their clothes and drop their weapons.
He did say that before the grand jury, but later he said that as the evidence mounted, the state reevaluated its position, as it does in any crime, any murder case.
Well, there was enormous pressure by the mayor, Frank Graves, to find the killers. They couldn't tolerate this specter of blacks taking control of the law. He offered promotions and raises to any police officer who brought the gunman to justice. And certainly these pressures contributed to the pursuit of Rubin Carter.
4 months later, Patterson police arrested Carter and Artis on the strength of new accounts from alleged eyewitnesses Alfred Bellow and Arthur Dexter Bradley.
According to Bellow's version, he was 14 feet away from Rubin and John when they saw Bellow. And Bellow says that he then turned and fled, these guys carrying guns.
If we were crazy enough to go in there and do that in that bar to those people, what would make us not crazy enough to do away with this fat person that we see running down the street? Or with the police when they stop us? What would make me suddenly become sane when I was just totally insane?
Although both Bellow and Bradley were convicted felons, it was Carter's criminal background that reached the public.
I was a young fan at the time, following boxing, and this was a man who had been in trouble, spent most of his time in prison. And when that story broke about him being arrested for the triple homicide, I must confess that I said, it figures.
A lot of people thought that maybe he did it because he was a tough guy. Maybe he got crazy enough one night to do something like this.
Patterson had a long reputation of being a very divisive community.
It was a racially polarized city in a particularly racially polarized era.
Born May 6, 1937, Rubin Carter grew up in Patterson, where the cops, the merchants, and the city fathers were white. Carter stuttered almost from his first words.
I suffered from a terrible speech impediment for the first 18 years of my life. And when people laughed at me, when I tried to talk, the only sound they'd hear in reply would be the sound of my fists whistling through the air.
Rubin learned that not only was he good, but he enjoyed it. He enjoyed the violence, even at that young age.
He was a street guy. You know, he was tough. We related to him as a duke, you know, with in the city. You know, he was one of the guys that everybody had to reckon with.
He was in an out-of-reform school. He committed crimes. He was a person going nowhere fast.
After an assault conviction at 14, Carter was sentenced to Jamesburg State Home for Boys. 2 years later, he escaped and sought cover in the Army, where he found a productive outlet for his anger.
He didn't even have the right kind of trunks and the right kind of shoes to fight. But Rubin got into the ring with the heavyweight champion of the Army at the time, and he knocks him down in the first round. And Rubin realized at that time that that was what his calling was.
The night I saw Rubin, the first time I saw him, fighting a fellow named Tommy Settles. I like to use metaphors, and I did that night. I called him the Hurricane from Patterson.
If there's any fighter that fit that description, that was true to that nickname, it was Hurricane Carter. The man fought like a human hurricane.
When he caught you, particularly early, he looked like a killing machine.
Rubin wore this black velvet robe, and the hood would come out further out from his face, like at least 2 inches out. So Rubin, when he came into the ring, his head was way back in here, and all you could see were those eyes staring at you, glaring at you. And it scared the hell out of a lot of people.
Even when you saw him in a little black and white TV long ago, you could see it. He was terrifying.
Rubin's strategy was to come and press, and he would always come, hook cross, cross hook, fire him, and he was firing to knock my head in the 55th row.
The best fighter he ever defeated was Emil Griffith, the former welterweight and middleweight champion.
Carter annihilated. 1 round, he knocked him out cold.
Defeating Griffith earned Carter a shot at middleweight champion Joey Giardello in 1964.
I said I want to fight Hurricane Carter. So would I be worried if I picked him?
He lumped up Giardello's face in the middle rounds. Giardello was able to take his best punch and not go down and not even get badly hurt. It took some steam out of Carter mentally.
And a hard left to the chin by Joey Giardello, and that one registered.
I just outboxed him. I don't ever remember getting hit by a punch with him.
Whenever an opponent resisted his power, he would get nervous and many times give up. But he was the type of skills and talent that he had. He should have never lost a fight. He was that great of a fighter, but he lacked that edge, the emotional edge.
Carter lost 7 of his next 15 fights, finishing with 27 wins, 12 losses, and 1 draw. If the public had never taken to Hurricane, part of the reason was provided by his own words.
In 1964, Milton Gross, a well-known sports writer, interviewed Rubin for an article in the Saturday Evening Post. This was a curtain raiser for the championship bout between Rubin and Joey Giardello. And he talked about how in the aftermath of a riot in Harlem, he wanted to take his own guns and go to Harlem and shoot some cops.
I wanted to take my guns and go up there and get me 4 or 5 of those cops. I know I can get 2 or 3 before they get me.
The story introduced a lot of non-boxing fans to Rubin for the first time, and there was an immediate backlash because you had this man who seemed like a dangerous maniac on the loose.
Nowhere was Carter's menacing persona more active than in his racially volatile hometown.
He was well known to the Patterson Police Department. He had an image even within boxing as being a very angry, violent.
Are you a black troublemaker?
Yes, I'm a black troublemaker. They were afraid of me because I felt about them exactly the way they felt about me. And I was ready to defend myself against them or anybody else in the world. That's why they had to get rid of me.
That definitely set him up to face the full force of the law in Passaic County.
Police were very highly pressured into solving this crime because it gave the appearance that it was for no reason at all. No robbery, no one spoke, no one said anything, just 2 people walk into a bar and start shooting up the place.
At the first trial of Hurricane Carter, there was a tremendous amount of racial tension in the air. There was a civil rights movement going on.
From the opening bell on April 7th, 1967, the trial of Rubin Carter and John Artis became the prosecution of one man's character.
I'm just that other person, that other body that has to be there because they need a second body.
John presented a problem for the prosecution because not only did he not have a record, but John had a number of character witnesses come in and testified.
The state's position was that John was misled by Carter, that they had been drinking that night, and John Artis went along with them.
All John Artis had to do, and he was the only one on this earth who could have done it, was to tell these police that I had something to do with this crime. And I would be dead.
The absence of a smoking gun created a wide spectrum of speculation.
They had witnesses identifying a white car, a white Dodge that had left the scene. There were witnesses identifying, saying that there were black men in the car. It just doesn't make sense that this was all a coincidence. At 2:30 in the morning, white Dodges riding around the streets of Patterson.
The 2 gunmen were clearly deep inside the bar when the shooting took place. They had to have had some evidence that they were in there on them, some evidence of blood. And yet they could never find a drop of blood anywhere associated with Rubin or John.
If there was no blood found on the defendants, prosecutor Vincent Hull did not hesitate to invoke the blood-stained clothes of the victims in an emotional appeal to the jury.
When you saw these bloody clothes, all you could think of, I would imagine, would be maybe some retribution for these individuals who had been murdered.
And the verdict was, we the jury found the defendants, Rubin Carter and John Artis, guilty. And my heart sunk, my breath felt like the breath went out of my body, my knees buckled.
All of it hurts. I'm not numbed out that I don't feel.
I remember Carter's first wife screaming loudly and for at least 2 minutes, no. It was a scream that I've never heard before or since. A scream of such agony.
That jury of all white folks, if they thought for a moment that John Artis and I would have murdered those people, they would have burned our asses to a bacon rind.
Unfortunately for those people who feel there was a matter of reasonable doubt, they weren't at the trial. The state showed through circumstantial evidence the likelihood that Carter and Artis did commit as charged.
When the jurors were leaving, one of the women jurors was crying, and as she came out of the jury box, she turned to one of the other jurors and she said, "I feel so sorry for him," and she pointed at me. But then she turned and her whole demeanor changed. She says, "But I feel nothing for him," as she pointed to Rubin.
Trenton State Prison is the front door to the insane asylum.
Some prisons in this country, as we know, they're just glorified Holiday Inns, but this is a big league prison.
It was a place that smelt terribly of human misery and waste.
As soon as Rubin got to prison, he decided that he was not going to let the prison treat him as if he were guilty. And that began with his refusal to put on the prison stripes.
I'm looking at him like, oh my God. And, you know, they're calling other assistants in there, and I'm watching now what happens in prison when someone becomes defiant or oppositional.
You just tell me where to go, and I'll go. But don't ever put your hands on me, because if you put your hands on me, you're gonna have to kill me immediately. Because if you don't, I'm gonna kill you.
They had Rubin sent to the hole for discipline.
I sat in prison in solitary confinement, eating hate like it was a succulent morsel of buttered steak.
In December of 1971, 3 months after inmates and guards died in a riot at Attica State Prison in upstate New York, prisoner unrest boiled over at Rahway State Prison, where Carter and Artis had been transferred.
It came about in part because there was a man there named Clay Thomas who took the stage during a film.
He takes a chair and he throws it through the screen. At that point, Rubin tried to engage him. Well, what's the matter? What's your problem? You want to fight or something? Come on up on the stage and fight me. And Clay was saying, nope, not going to fight you, Rubin. You know, I'm tired of this. I'm ready to die.
I said, I will not go along with this. And anybody who doesn't go along with this, I'm leaving this auditorium. Come go with me. So half of the people left, half stayed.
The superintendent came up, Vuksevich, who wasn't well liked because he had made a lot of derogatory remarks about prisoners. And from out of nowhere, a guy dove across the crowd and stabbed him. And from there, a pandemonium broke out.
We were being held hostage, but some of the men wanted to, you know, finish us off right then and there, I guess you could say.
What's happened here today should come as a surprise to no one, particularly since Attica, prison officials across the country have been warning of impending rebellions within their institution.
It could have went either way, but fortunately, Governor Cahill, to his credit, used a lot of restraint to keep it from an Attica.
There was hope that if we did delay, that we might be able to bring reason to the prisoners.
Hurricane Carter became probably, from what I've talked to guards and prisoners, the most charismatic prisoner that ever lived.
When you're in prison, it is like the ultimate timeout. Eventually, a person who has some goal in mind will sit down and exercise. The only thing that he really can exercise in there is his mind. And Rubin did that.
I started studying the law. I was determined that our case, that our stories be heard. I was going to write my autobiography, The 16th Round.
Rubin had never written so much as an English term paper. He finished his formal education when he was in 8th grade.
It took me all of about 3 or 4 years.
I thought parts of it were almost like the autobiography of Malcolm X. It was a mishmash, as Rubin is a mishmash of the real and the fake and the good and the bad, as we all are.
Everybody ought to read this book. It's by a guy who barely had an education. It's a miracle of literacy. It's powerful. It's got cadence. It's strong. It's got a message. It's a well-done book.
So well done that the message reached Fred Hogan, an investigator with the Public Defender's Office, who knew Carter during his boxing years and believed him to be innocent.
I said to him, you know, the only way you're going to get out of here is through the system, whether it's anger or fear or hate. Let's put it all together in getting out through the system.
As Hogan quietly began investigating the case, he also brought it to the attention of investigative reporter Selwyn Rabb of the New York Times.
In the summer of '73, I read the trial transcript, and one thing jumped out at me specifically, and this concerned the two main witnesses against Carter and against your own artist, that was Bellow and Bradley.
I knew that these two guys were the weak links in this chain, and I realized that eventually, when the cops no longer benefit them, that they're going to switch up on the cops too.
And so Hogan spent several years reading the testimony, trying to track these guys down, and finally getting them to acknowledge that indeed they had lied in the first trial.
When I had everything from Bellow and Bradley, I decided I had to see the Lieutenant Vincent DeSimone, who was the head detective in the investigation. And I told him, look, we've looked into the case. We think there's a story here. We're going to write a story. He got up. And he said, I've got a bad heart. And he put his hand on his pistol that was in his belt. And he said, if something happens to me, I'm not going alone.
It was Bellow's testimony that had been the most damaging, since he claimed to be the closest to the murderers as they fled.
I told him it may be and it may not be. There's a possibility. But at the they were telling me it is them.
I suspect, and have right along, that he changed his testimony for one reason, out of fear that he would end up in state prison with Carter and or some of his friends, and that he would either be beaten or possibly killed because of his testimony.
The recantations led to everything that has happened ever since.
Despite not being convinced that the Bellow and Bradley recants were enough new evidence to reopen the case, Fred Hogan and Jack Noonan, Carter's lawyer at the time, went to file motion papers. Their timing couldn't have been better.
We're walking in the courthouse, and a guy comes up, I think he was a private investigator, knew Jack. And the guy said, is he all right to talk in front of him?
I said, sure, this guy's all right. He said, don't mention my name, but the prosecutor's office is listening to a tape that was not given to the defense team in the first case.
And Noonan looks at me and says, what tape's that, Hogan? I said, there is no tape. There was no tape. He said, are you sure? I said, Noonan, there was no tape in '66.
On the tape, Lieutenant DeSimone could be heard promising leniency to Bellow in return for his cooperation in the investigation of the triple murders for which Carter and Artis had been convicted.
In the first trial, they never told the defense about the deals they made with Bellow and Bradley.
Now there was not only a ring of truth, but there was some substance to it.
The first article I wrote about the Carter Artis case was in September of 1974, and the Times put it on page 1. This case suddenly became one of the major cause celebs.
Ali led a march to the state capitol just a few weeks after the thriller in Manila. They had a couple thousand people there.
His daughter's getting big, and she's looking fine, too. And the daughter, I'm going to be the stepdaddy until he gets out.
He consistently offered of himself his support for Rubin, emotionally and spiritually. He'd write notes to Rubin.
When Muhammad decided to join the fray, never one time did that man waver in doing anything that I suggested him
do. Yeah, Bob Dylan writes an 8-minute song about your case. It's better than a brief to the Supreme Court.
Dylan, who had read Carter's book, wanted to meet him.
Rubin had never heard Dylan's songs before, but he read some of his lyrics to prepare for the meeting, and Dylan goes there, and the two men formed an immediate bond. Both were performers. Both were also reclusive and rather shy.
We talked for 8-9 hours about all kinds of things. I mean, Dylan and I were very much in tune with one another. About a week later, he showed up again, telling me that he wanted me to listen to this demo, that he wrote this song. I didn't know he was going to write a song.
Here comes the story of the hurricane, the man the authorities came to blame for something that he never done. Put in a prison cell, but one time he could have been the champion of the world.
In December of 1975, Dylan's Night of the Hurricane concert rallied public support behind Carter. 3 months later, the New Jersey Supreme Court overturned the murder convictions of Carter and Artis, opening the way for a second trial. Under fire from the pro-Carter stories in the press, the Passaic County prosecutor proposed a deal.
Burl Ives Humphrey did offer Rubin's lawyers the opportunity to take another lie detector exam, and if they passed the exam, Humphreys promised that they would not be tried a second time.
Why, after 1976, when the New Jersey State Supreme Court said that our convictions was nullified based upon hidden evidence, why would we believe or trust the prosecutor's office in anything they say?
When they decided to try for a second time, I was confident. We're going to get you this time. You know, you won the first round, but you're not going to win this one.
Optimism increased when New York attorneys Louis Steele and Myron Beldock joined the cause pro bono. Understandably, they were not welcomed with open arms by many in the white establishment of Patterson.
The atmosphere was deadly. And the hostility, you could feel it as you walked down the hallways, as you walked up to the court, as you came any place near it. And we were the enemy.
They resent that at such a level that you can engage that resentment by saying, look, you're getting pushed around by a bunch of rich people from Manhattan.
Nelson Algren, the novelist, was hired by Esquire magazine to do a story about the Rubin Carter case. And he moved to Patterson. When people found out what he was looking into, they ran him out of town. I mean, this is a very famous and successful novelist and a tough guy.
At the start of the new trial, Bello dropped a bomb. He returned to his original testimony, placing Carter and Artis at the crime scene. And the prosecution introduced a new motive of racial revenge for the killing of a black man earlier on the same night.
As if that would cause blacks in general, blacks in Patterson in general, and Rubin Carter and John Artis to go out and kill white people.
This is a northern version of a lynching, that if you tell a predominantly white jury from a suburb in New Jersey, blacks are murderous people who will go out and take revenge if one of their number is killed, then you're going to frighten everybody. And that was the theory.
I was held in contempt for fighting that racial revenge theory coming into evidence, and the prosecutor finally said to the judge, "Judge, you gotta let it come into evidence, otherwise I'm gonna lose the case." Well, that's no legal argument.
I've got to admit, from being an old ex-prosecutor also, that it was a clever ploy, but there was no foundation for it.
If they get me now and John Artis now, they're coming for you tomorrow, brother.
With prosecutors waving the race card, Carter's defense team believed they needed their lead defendant to tell his side of the story. But Carter felt otherwise.
Rubin, especially with the racial revenge theory in the case, really had to convince this jury he was not a killer.
I was surprised that he didn't testify in his own behalf in the second trial.
The judge, I believe, has to charge a jury that they are not to take into consideration the fact that he did not take the witness stand. But who knows what goes through the minds of the jurors.
Carter told me that he was so suspicious of the system at that point that he did not believe there was any way he could win if he testified.
Those people who contend that I should have taken that stand are not the people who had to pay the consequences of that action. The whole case was based around putting the 16th round on trial, taking little excerpts far out of content in order to try to prove that this was a racial revenge situation.
It was, 1976, but it might as well have been 1966 all over again.
After the conviction was read, and I said to him, Rubin, everything has changed. All the plans we had are gone. And he said, no, everything's gone back to the way it was, Tom.
I hated everybody because they just let this thing happen.
What you are seeing is a person who has been raped of his freedom.
They just let it happen and everybody runs away. And everybody goes away and you go back to prison. And you got to survive that because I still wasn't guilty.
After the second conviction, Rubin had a completely different change of mind from the first conviction.
He was really bitter about white people, about what they had done, what they had taken from him. They had took away his wife, his child, his freedom, and had put him into this place.
I knew that if I didn't get rid of this hate, if I didn't learn or find some way to forgive members of the white tribe for having done what they did to me, that I was going to destroy myself.
He threw himself emotionally and intellectually into a kind of spirit world where he was able to hold himself together through all of these trials, through all of the inhumanity.
That's when I turned prison into an unnatural laboratory of the human spirit and began to search and excavate all of the cultures on this earth to try to find something that's going to make some meaning, give me some reason, give me some understanding of what this is all about.
He would stay up all night long reading books. His schedule is reversed, so he'd go to bed early in the morning when the prison was coming to life. So he would stay up all night long immersed in these books and these ideas.
He told me that he ripped away his whole identity when he went to prison. He just ripped it away, and ripped it away until finally the person who went into jail did not exist anymore.
In 1980, Carter's jailhouse autobiography reached Lesra Martin, a Brooklyn teenager who had been taken in by members of a Canadian commune.
Lesra was so moved by Rubin's book that he kept reading sections of it out loud to us. And so eventually, all of us in our group read it.
I decided to write Rubin a letter because after I finished stumbling through Rubin's book, I wanted him to know that in many ways, as an author, he had provided a breakthrough for me.
When Lesra's letter came in, I was in good enough space to be able to feel the vibrations of this letter.
I remember the day that he ran sort of into the living room carrying the letter from Rubin. Hey, he wrote back. Can you believe it?
He said in that letter to me that day that he felt compelled to respond to me in the same way I felt compelled to write them. Those are words that I'll carry with me forever.
After a series of letters were exchanged, Lesra met Rubin in prison.
I was absolutely petrified when I walked up to the prison, and I remember standing in the visiting room, and I was visibly shaking, yet I was frozen in my footstep. Rubin actually came up to me and said, "You must be Lesra."
I see someone who is brave enough to enter into a Trenton State Prison in the death house of Trenton State Prison, where our visit was.
As I got up to leave Rubin that day, I knew that at that particular moment, whatever had to be done, needed to be done to get an innocent man out of jail.
Rubin's relationship with Lesra proliferated into communications with three of his caretakers, Lisa Peters, Sam Chayton, and Terry Swinton. They joined Carter's fight for freedom and justice.
They were a great support team for Rubin. They did a lot to try to keep him focused and to rejuvenate him.
They made a commitment. They said, we are here for the duration and that we are going home.
Because of the way we were living, this team
up here in Canada. We were able to have 3 of us go down to New Jersey, investigate the case, work with Rubin's lawyers, while the other members of our group were back in Canada working to support us.
The Carter case was the most litigated criminal case in New Jersey history, and the paperwork numbered literally in the tens of thousands of pages. And very gradually, Terry and I actually became experts on the factual portions of the case and all the documents.
Any cracks in the prosecution's case converged on Bello's contradictory statements about Carter's exact location at the time of the murders. Carter's lawyers, meanwhile, spoke with the man who conducted polygraph tests on Bello before the second trial.
Somehow, the lie detector test report was worded in a way which made it appear like Bello was telling the story the prosecutor wanted to hear, and that was the truth.
The false results of the polygraph were used by the prosecution to get Bello to change his testimony.
They could have destroyed Bello on a stand. They could have not only destroyed his credibility, they could have really raised questions about the tactics and the ethics of the prosecution, and they could have won the case.
Thus armed with evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, Carter and his defense team filed for a federal writ of habeas corpus.
Federal courts, in reviewing habeas corpus petitions, decide whether or not there's been a violation of the United States Constitution.
It was time to go federal because we had been trapped in the state courts for 19 years, going back around and around to the very same people who were involved in this case originally.
You had to get into the federal system, where in almost every state, the caliber of federal judges is much higher than state judges.
In the year that Rubin's writ of habeas corpus was filed, 1985, there were 8,000 filed that year in the country. Only 3% were granted.
After almost 2 decades in prison, Rubin Carter takes his last stand for freedom.
Going to the federal court was really Rubin Carter's last chance. I mean, he knew that. We all knew that. It was make or break time.
Rubin knew that Judge Sarakin was his last hope for ever getting out of prison. And he had come to the decision in his own mind that he could no longer stay in that prison.
I remember the night before the decision came down, he was clearing out his cell in anticipation of a positive outcome. And, it was freaking the other prisoners out.
So he was either going to leave under the auspices of Judge Sarakin, or he was going to leave on his own. And if they killed him, he would rather have death than spend another night in that prison.
On November 7th, 1985, Judge Sarakin's decision was released. His ruling focused on 2 issues: the prosecution's controversial racial revenge theory and the withholding of Bello's lie detector results.
I handed it, I think, to the lawyers for Carter, and I said, "Congratulations." And the next thing I heard screaming in the hallway.
The prisoners went wild. They were ecstatic. Guards, too, because they saw before them a person who from day one did not change his attitude one iota.
Once Judge Sarakin released his decision, it was still unclear what was going to happen to Rubin. The authorities wanted to keep Rubin in prison until the appeals were exhausted. And so this issue came before Judge Sarakin the following day.
Courtroom was totally filled. Relatives, friends, lawyers, lots of reporters. It was a very, in this sense, a true Hollywood scene.
When I looked at Judge Sarakin and I saw in his eyes, I saw the eagle of the person that he is, I had no doubts whatsoever.
The courtroom just erupted. Everybody was on their feet cheering, applauding, screaming.
Some people think that I still should be in prison. The courts of the United States happen to disagree with that.
The dispute between Rubin and his adversaries has always been a blood feud, and Rubin's enemies will always believe he's a killer. They say that Rubin was freed because of a technicality.
If
just absolutely galls me that anyone can say that a violation of someone's constitutional rights is a loophole. I mean, that is a loophole that you could drive a truck through that protects you every single day from the police coming, knocking on your door and rifling through your possessions.
I think his constitutional legacy is probably much more important than his pugilistic legacy.
I remember telling them when they make a list of the greatest boxers of the 20th century, I said, I don't think they're going to talk about you, I said. But if they make a list of the greatest fighters of the 20th century, you're going to be at the top of the list.
I have come to know him since then, and if he is guilty, then he's a better actor than Denzel Washington.
This man right here is love. He's all love. He lost about 7,300 days of his life.
Carter still lives in Toronto, vowing never to go back to Patterson. Despite his transformation from a self-described rattlesnake to an articulate advocate for the wrongly accused, Carter bears scars, physical and psychological, from prison. Early in his incarceration, he lost an eye in a botched operation. In 1978, he and his wife May Thelma divorced, ending years of emotional pain for Rubin, who couldn't bear her seeing him behind bars. Meanwhile, John Artis, the other man in the white car, became a counselor at a youth center in Virginia. For ESPN Classic Sports Century, I'm Chris Fowler.